Howdy, it's Jonathan with Crusoe Studio. Today I'm going to be going over how a camera works, the three different principles that kind of dictate how your photo turns out, like the brightness levels and whatnot. And I'm going to be illustrating this here on this paper. It's going to be the most bare bones, rudimentary thing you've ever seen in your life. But if you have zero information on how a camera works and kind of how the system itself operates, this will probably give you a little bit more insight into some technical details. And if you already kind of get the gist of how it works, might give you a little bit better perspective on what the numbers mean and kind of what the pros and cons to changing each one is if you're not quite sure of the relationship between the three. All right, first things first, what is a camera? Well, a camera is a box, preferably a very, very dark box, as dark as you can get it. But inside this box, there is a sensor or photosensitive paper. It depends on whether you're shooting digital or film. The sensor is just an electronic device that is sensitive to light. It pretty much transfers light info to digital info, right? Just same thing that photosensitive paper does, but it kind of adds a bunch of complicated steps to give you digital photography. Photosensitive paper is just what it sounds like. It's paper that is sensitive to light. So it changes color, changes brightness depending on how much light touches it. So inside this very, very dark box, there is something that is sensitive to light. And while this box is closed, there is zero light in this box. Now, if we look over here to this handy dandy little drawing, this is what happens when you poke a hole in that box. So we've got the hole, we've got the light on the outside, it comes in and it hits the paper or the sensor. And how much light hits it, it depends on how bright the image is. Rather, how bright the image is depends on how much light hits the sensor. And so with that in mind, how much light hits the sensor, dictating how bright the image is, how do you control how much light hits the sensor? Well, there's a couple ways. So here we have the handy dandy photo triangle, and these are the three things that dictate how bright your image is. So the ISO, the shutter speed, and the f-stop or aperture. It's interchangeable. So ISO, International Organization of Standardization, you don't need to know that. I even had to look that up. It's, a really long, unnecessary thing. So with ISO, this is pretty much the easiest one to understand. This is essentially how sensitive the paper or the sensor is to light. So you put the same amount of light on a less sensitive sensor, it'll be darker. You put that same amount of light on a more sensitive sensor, it'll be brighter, right? That's pretty self-explanatory. The downside to this is that the more sensitive the sensor or the photosensitive paper is, the more noise or grain that you introduce into it. Now, noise is usually what you call it for digital photography. That's kind of interchangeable between both digital and film. But grain is almost explicitly for film because the way that they get the paper to be more sensitive is to have silver halide crystals that make up the paper. How big those crystals are dictates how much light gets reflected and absorbed and how bright the image is. It's like a whole science. This isn't a science lesson, but yeah. So grain is for film because it's got actual grains of silver in it. And then noise is for digital, but it's interchangeable between the two. That's the easiest one, how sensitive it is to light. Shutter speed is the second easiest to understand because there's a couple ways you can physically change how much light enters the camera, and shutter speed is one of those two ways. Let's think of this as your camera, this as your photosensitive paper, and this as your lens or your opening in the camera to let in light. This right here, we'll refer to this as the shutter. So you have our opening here and you open the shutter and that lets light in, and then you close the shutter to block the light off. And how long that shutter is open is your shutter speed. Essentially what this is you open this up, expose it to light for a set amount of time, and then close it. So the more time that you expose it to light, the brighter the image will be because that's more light hitting the paper. And the less time you expose it to light, the darker the image will be because it's less light that's entering the camera. There are some drawbacks to having more light entering the camera for a longer amount of time, and that is you're trying to take a still image. And if this is open for, let's say, 1 second of light, that's letting a lot of light into the camera, but if anything in that 1 second changes in the frame, it's letting those changes hit the paper as well. So that's how you get kind of blurry, not really, like really mushy photos. Like, have you ever been trying to take a picture with your phone at night and it's just really crappy, and because you have to hold it really still, or you're trying to take a picture of the stars or something and your phone is like, hey, you got to hold it pretty still. It's because in order to get that picture, it's got to have a higher shutter speed, even on something as advanced like your phone. So that one's pretty easy. That is how long your shutter is open for. And so more light will enter your camera. And so the longer it's open, the blurrier the image. So you want to try to keep it as low as possible to try to balance blurriness with brightness. And then we get into the hardest to understand principle, but still not terribly difficult to understand. And that is the aperture or the f-stop. So the aperture is actually how big the hole that lets the light in is. Right? So before we have just our shutter speed, which is how long it's exposed. But now if we expose that same time, but in a bigger hole, that's letting more light in. Now, one of the downsides to having such a big hole in the front of the camera is that the focus plane is going to be really shallow. And let me show you what that means. So here we have examples of the focus planes and how that kind of works. So this line here would be what's in focus in the image. And so the smaller our aperture, the smaller our hole. This is the world's biggest camera here, by the way, and our little camera guy. We have the smallest aperture right here, which lets in not very much light. So it's going to be a really dark image, but the benefit to that is if you're doing a landscape or something like that, you have your subject here, your foreground and your background. And this line here shows us that with a really high, well, really small aperture or really high f-stop, there's a lot in focus. So it's going to be really dark. So you're going to have your other three or your other two settings set, pretty high. But what that gives us is everything in focus. Now you set it to kind of medium. It's like a regular sized hole. Let's say f5 to f7. That's going to give us enough where our subject is in focus. You have a little bit of leeway to and fro to kind of get a little bit more of the environment that they're in focus and stuff. This would be pretty good for portraits if you're trying to incorporate what the person is doing in the portrait. And this is where most lenses lie. A good middle ground where the biggest hole you're able to get is a pretty good medium for, it's still kind of dark if it's low light, so you need to bump your other two settings up. But if you're trying to get anything just a regular out in the middle of the day, getting a portrait, this is going to be what you're kind of going with here. That's going to be kind of your focus range. Now you see here we have a really big opening, a really large aperture. This is going to be your 1.2, your 1.8, your freaking 0.85, the really crazy big apertures. The benefit to these apertures is that in low light conditions, they're spectacular, right? They are absolutely outstanding. You can get the darkest of venues and you're able to get a pretty much daylight looking image. The downside to these is that the focus plane, as you can see, is really, really tiny. Just absurdly tiny. I'm talking someone's nose is in focus, but their eyeball isn't in focus. Like their eyelashes are in focus, but the rest of their face isn't. So you really got to be careful with how your camera's autofocus works if you're dealing with that, or if you're manually focusing, bless your soul, it's going to be really difficult. To counteract this, you can put your subject farther away. And so with them being slightly out of focus kind of is negated by the pixel difference of your megapixel. If you're shooting super high megapixel, it's going to be still pretty obviously out of focus. But the farther away the subject helps with the thinner area of focus. That's pretty much aperture in a nutshell. The bigger the focus range, the smaller the hole and the darker the image. But on the contrary, the bigger the hole in the camera, the brighter the image is because it's letting in way more light, but your focus area is going to be really, really shallow. And I'm pretty sure that's all I got. That's a pretty bare bones, simple explanation for the photo triangle and kind of how a camera works. I hope I was able to explain that pretty clearly, and I guess I'll see you guys in the next one.